So we're very pleased to have Barbara Foorman as our wrap-up speaker. We're changing topics slightly. We're moving from mental health services to reading. However, those of you who work in mental health services know that most of the children that we work with, especially children in poverty, also have problems academically, and in particular problems with reading. And everything we do with them won't amount to a hill of beans unless we can also teach them how to read so they can succeed in society. Dr. Foorman is one of the world's leading authorities, if not the leading authority, on teaching reading for young children. She was the director of the NCER, National Center for Education Research, at the IES since 2007 or 2006? 2005, and then at FCRR? Since 2006. FCRR, we should be very proud in Florida because Florida has the single best resource in the world for studying and learning about teaching reading, the Florida Center for Reading Research at FSU. In the past, we had the director of that center give a keynote talk on this topic at the Niagara Conference. That was Joe Torgerson. He's retired, and Dr. Foorman is his able replacement, so we're very pleased that she was able to come down today, and what she will do is update us on evidence-based reading intervention research in K-12 and tell us what the best practices are for working on teaching reading, especially with children who are having difficulties in that domain. So please help me welcome Dr. Foorman. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for inviting me here to a conference on child and adolescent mental health. I know very little about that area. I'm an academic who focuses on reading and formerly a teacher. And know a number of you are from Miami-Dade and surrounding school districts perhaps, and hope to be doing early literacy intervention research starting in the fall for the next 3 years. So I'll be down in Miami quite a bit. I came to reading in a rather different route. I started out as an Asian studies major on the West Coast and was fascinated with Japanese. So I learned Japanese. I lived in Japan, and I was astounded how literate the Japanese were. And I said, how does this happen? And you have so many characters you learn each day throughout your academic years in elementary and secondary, and you can't miss a step. If you miss a step, the parents are providing tutoring to keep you caught up. And they do let people graduate based on attendance. So effort matters, and it's one of the most literate nations on earth. Now the good news is that Florida now is the fourth best reading scores in the world. This is kind of a media spin. Florida oversampled in the latest international PISA literacy competition and came out number 4 in the world. So this is now the Florida Department of Education's starting topic in any conversation about how great we are. So now the states in the Southeast are all trying to replicate Florida. So I'm spending a lot of my time helping, well, more than the Southeast, Kansas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, South Carolina, Mississippi. But I always start out with, Florida did this with a lot of resources, $780 million in Reading First funds, and then your district reading plans get you money. So there is, we're lucky in Florida to have resources put into reading. Mississippi's trying to do it with 0 increase from the legislature. So it just can't be done. You have to have the resources to do it. So I was fascinated with how language, oral language and written language map onto each other. That was my interest in Japanese. And then I started to look at other mappings with Spanish, with English, did research in that area, and then as a teacher taught middle school and high school, and my kids couldn't read. And I thought, what? So, you know, you go into what they call high vocabulary, high interest, low vocabulary reading materials. That's the term that was used for, 30, 40 years. And it's a real effort. You can motivate kids, you can teach them past grade 6, but it's really tough because they're way behind, and it's, it's kind of humiliating to have to learn about cracking the code and reading the Bob books when you're a teenager. So I wanted to learn how to do it right the first time around. So then I focused on beginning reading, and I've never really gotten away from that area. But I also became interested in policy. And so the talk will have a blend of policy issues and academic findings, research findings. So in a way, this is a meta-analysis I'm presenting. The data, a lot of the first half of the slides are actually coming out in an IES Practice guide. I was the panel chair, and it should have been out by now, but IES moves a little slowly, so it'll be out in the summer, and it's called Foundational Skills in Support of Reading for Understanding. Very teacher-friendly document. Lots of examples, lots of appendices of things that teachers can do. So this is actually updating the National Reading Panel with all the research available from 2000 to right now. If you know about IES and the What Works Clearinghouse, you can Google the What Works Clearinghouse. Some people joke it's the What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse because the rigor of the analyses results often in a very small pool of studies that meet their evidence levels. So for example, in this practice guide on foundational skills, it's a huge area. There's been 40 years of solid research. There were 800 studies they started with. It narrowed down to 80 studies actually meeting their standards. And you can say, oh, that's terrible. But actually, 80 studies meeting their standards is about 4 times the number of studies of any other practice guide. So I am working in an area that has made a lot of progress, and so really it's our job is to get the word out about what does work in learning to read. And then the challenge of reading to learn I'll get to as well. So the first take-home message, foundational skills in oral language and alphabetics, how the alphabet works, are crucial to reading success. This is particularly important with the Common Core, the adoption of the English Language Arts Common Core, which also is in all the content area subjects as well, because it's English Language Arts, but it's also social studies or history, science, and mathematics. The problem is that the foundational skills part is there, but you could miss it. It's not one of the 10 anchor standards in the English Language Arts Common Core. Nothing about foundational skills is an anchor standard. This has a researcher like me terrified. So please try to tell your teachers to implement the Common Core well, but make sure they find the foundational part, because if those aren't in place, guess what? Nothing else will follow well. Some predictors of reading comprehension are more malleable than others, and I'll show you some things that are. There are certain strategies and things you can do with older students that where you can make a difference. It's very hard to make a difference in the 2 things that predict adolescent reading, which is world knowledge or prior knowledge as people call it, and then verbal reasoning skills. You got to start on those things early. Pre-K would be a really ideal place to start with those things. Effective strategies for improving reading comprehension build on knowledge of how students learn, and I might add how adult teachers learn, because if you're going to do professional development well, you need to know something about adult learning. This is a very busy slide, but we've been very busy at FCRR with 3 of the 6 nationally funded IES Reading for Understanding grants, and I'm on the assessment team for that. And we have aligned the new Florida assessments for instruction and reading that FCRR developed to the Common Core, and have a lot more in the oral language area in that assessment. So we have found oral language syntax, the grammar of language, is a huge predictor from pre-K all the way through grade 12. The construct and how you measure it can change over time. We've been doing latent change modeling across these grades, but the importance of understanding word order, how things relate to each other in English, predicts listening comprehension before kids can read, and then it predicts reading comprehension. It's been very neglected. Listening comprehension is also a predictor of reading comprehension. And the nice thing about listening comprehension measures, they pick up the attention and memory aspect, which is important. And we have a new task in the FAIR assessments that's called, we have a sentence structure task that gets at syntax, and then we have following directions. We use that because that's malleable in the teacher's eyes. Teachers know that Susie is not paying attention. She's going to go stand next to Susie and make sure that she's hearing what she's saying. Maybe she'll break down the directions into smaller chunks so that Susie is sure to understand. This task on a computer tablet or laptop has children clicking and dragging objects to different parts of the line, like put the heart in front of the hat, and then it gets increasingly more complex. The kids love it, but it's really also picking up listening comprehension, attention, and memory. It's a huge predictor of listening comprehension, not surprisingly, and then reading comprehension. So we're trying to build in more of these kinds of tasks so that teachers in the primary grades are pay more attention to oral language and the kind of oral language that impacts written language. Vocabulary, obviously very important, both expressive, receptive, alphabetic knowledge, reading, comprehension. Then written response is a big part of the Common Core. Knowing how to write your name in pre-K is a huge predictor of writing success later. And in the Common Core, you write in response to what you read. Constructed response is back alive and well. And then I mentioned already prior knowledge, self-regulation, motivation, and engagement. These are hard to measure. They're often involved in lots of the tasks that we give, and they're an enormously important piece of the predictive pie. So this slide tells you everything you need to know about how to teach reading. First of all, teach academic language. I'll define these things on subsequent slides. Teach what I'm calling alphabetics, phonological awareness, letter name, letter sound knowledge, practice blending, to read simple words, to build words. And a very good little book is Isabel Beck's Making Sense of Phonics. Very cheap, paperback, Guilford Press. You can buy it. It has in the appendices cut out combinations of letters, laminate them, cut them up, build words. It would be a great, cheap thing to do with after school or summer reading. We'll answer questions at the end, okay? Then provide sequential explicit instruction in letter sound and sound spelling patterns. A good core reading program should do this well with opportunities to practice words in isolation and in connected text reading. And sprinkle in the high-frequency words that are irregular. English has a lot of them. The Anglo-Saxon part of the English is full of these high-frequency irregular words. So they create a memory load, so don't sprinkle too many at one time. Just sprinkle them across the primary grades. Teach word analysis with syllable patterns and multiple syllables. So this gets into the more advanced phonics as well as the morphological layer of English. I'll have 2 slides on that coming up in a minute. And then the text reading, daily text reading with and without feedback, with attention to accuracy of reading words, fluency, meaning the consolidation of the alphabetic principle, and understanding what you read. So that's it in a nutshell, but now I'll go on to have several slides to explain each one of these points. So academic language is this new hot buzz term that's the Common Core has kind of invited. What is it? Academic language is the language of written text. It's the language which we don't speak because we all have a dialect. We all have an informal register that we use. But to understand written text, you need to know that academic language of the written text. So, for example, Keith Stanovich pointed out that the word occurrence is a highly frequent word in printed text in 3rd grade. It's very rare in oral spoken language. Explicitly teach narrative language skills. That's how stories are structured, characters, plot, main idea. And then you can do this by having students summarize, retelling, talking about the conflict and how it was resolved, making logical predictions based on reading one page, what's likely to happen next. And then there are linguistic elements of the narrative structure, like pronouns. You're reading along, oh my gosh, here's the word he, what does that refer to? Well, it's, 10 sentences above. You figure out, you have to go back to figure that out. So there are many narrative skills you can practice in oral language that need to transfer to written language. And then a very good way to teach these oral language skills is through listening comprehension. So at the same time you're teaching decoding, how the alphabet works, with pretty simple structure words, you're reading to your students at some point during the day in text that's above their reading level to build their oral language, their vocabulary, but their sense of syntax, how the grammar of the story works. You have to do that. If you don't do that enough, guess what? You're going to have great word callers who don't understand what the text means. And we know about this phenomena with English learners, but guess what? It's a phenomena with all kids. They can learn to decode if taught well, but then they can't make sense of what they're pronouncing. So we have to do the oral language part early. If we did nothing in pre-K but oral language, we would be well served. So teach recognition and manipulation of sound segments in speech, provide explicit instruction in letter sound knowledge, and use word building to link these letter sound relations with the instruction and phonemic awareness. So, tell me what the first sound of table is, and you go, okay, now point to the letter that goes with that sound, giving 3 different letters, and you can, of course, make the letters confusing at a certain point because visual discrimination of the letters is important as well. Then we get into a sequence of going through letter sound relations, and the Isabel Beck book I mentioned is very nice because it goes through this sequence. Building CVC words, then the final E, which trips kids up and takes more time than you think, and then CVCC words, and CCVC words. So there's a whole progression that the most impactful decoding programs on the What Works Clearinghouse, high levels of evidence, use these sequences. Now, you've heard the word phonological awareness, phonemic awareness. Marilyn Adams helped to bring this work to our attention in her 1990 book, Beginning to Read. The Haskins Lab, for 2 decades prior to that actually did the hard work. Isabel Lieberman did the work to make us understand how, with speech that has to be mapped to written language, you have to psychologically recover the segments of sound in your oral speech that map to the letters. This is not something we're born knowing how to do. And English has a few tricky parts to it, so it requires a little bit of attention. So you can start very easily with tokens and have the student hear the word flat, or start with sun, that's easier, and just move these are not letter tiles, these are first just objects like a tile with no letter on it, to represent each sound segment in that word sun. That word sun has no phonemes in a spectrographic analysis. What you have to do is recover those segments by saying, for example, how does sun differ from sat? Or sun differ, we'll take big different from bit. They're different in the final sound. And then how does big differ from bag? They're different in the medial sound, and so on, so that you can kind of contrast these phonemic segments and you come up with what is the distinctive difference between the sound, between the words, which are these phonemes, the minimal unit of sound that conveys a meaningful difference. And then you get more complicated with a word like flat. So there's no print when you do this kind of what's called an Elkonin box. This is a classic technique for teaching beginning reading. Then you can move it into print, and now your tiles have letters on them. And then you can make it more complicated. So for the word sit, you give them 3 letters, which one goes at the end, which is the final letter sound, and make it a little more complex. But obviously you're moving sequentially so that you're not losing any child. This can be done ideally it should be done in groups, and the groups really shouldn't be larger than 5, but maybe 6 if all the students are at the same level. So what we found that worked best in our reading first work in Florida, we found lots of different models, but bringing all adults to bear on the front line of core reading instruction for 90 minutes plus, bringing retired teachers back, to help staff a small group. You can actually get all kids learning to read in the tier 1, the first classroom level of instruction. That's the goal, because it gets very expensive if you have to do pull-out, which you're probably going to have to do, but if you can minimize the number of students you have to do that with, you can then afford it. Okay, so then we have complications in English where you have blends where each of the 2 letters make a distinct sound, and then we have digraphs where 2 letters make the same sound, like SH. All that has to be learned in a sequential manner with practice. Practice is what experts need to become expert. So we do blending, we get into reading decodable words, we teach high frequency words that are not so decodable. You just teach them holistically so you can move along. Unfortunately, only about 14% of English words are actually not decodable. And that kind of overstates it, because you have a word like laugh where the AU is not regular pronunciation, but nothing wrong with L, and the GH could be a phonics rule. So English, it gets a lot of bad press, but you know what? 69% of the beginning single syllable words in English all follow, they're all decodable. So teach the alphabetic principle, which is how the letters relate to sounds. Do that because you can quickly become productive in writing words and reading words, and then you sprinkle in some of these high-frequency words and some non-decodable words to make a good story. So Tyrannosaurus Rex, put it in there because very motivating to talk about dinosaurs. This is Louisa Motz's graph in her book, Print to Speech, which shows you some of the joys of English, which is why I'm never out of a job. So you have the phonemes, starting with long E, going all the way around to the double O pattern in print. And you have schwa at the top, and then on the left you have diphthongs, and then on the right you have the R controlled. All these things need to be taught and practiced. The tricky thing is the core reading programs give you keywords for each of those sounds, each of the phonemes. They give you one keyword, and then they'll give you maybe practice on just one layer down in the list under each phoneme, and that's it. You're on your own. That is a problem. What happens is we lose a whole lot of kids because the core reading program isn't getting to the depth of English orthography. Orthography means the way the spelling system works. So some of the core reading programs got the great idea of having this vowel chart around the room, and then having some of these alternate spellings listed below the letter sound pattern. And you'll see kids look up at the chart as they're writing to find the right spelling pattern. That's a great idea. So a lot of other core reading programs have adopted that approach. It's very good. I would say just putting the cards up there is one thing, but you actually need to have some instruction around these patterns. And what you get to with English, you got to have some spelling instruction. I'll show you in a minute that that's the way you're going to be able to learn how to remember some of these inconsistent vowel patterns. Here are some of the high-frequency words. Some of them are irregular, but some are quite regular. So you don't need to spend too much time on the regular high-frequency words because you've already taught kids how to decode. The irregular ones are the ones that you would have them memorize. And this is where some school districts send home a list of these irregular words for parents to work with their kids on. So word analysis strategies. This gets into a deeper level of English. So it gets into some of the inconsistencies with vowel teams like I just talked about. It gets into closed and open syllables, and these things are what we would call advanced phonics instruction, taught typically later in first grade or beginning of second. Then multisyllabic words. This gets into the Greek and Latin layer of English, and this is totally neglected. The Common Core says you teach this in third grade, and by sixth grade you're a master of it, but they don't talk about the intermediary grades, what the standards should be. So I'm a little nervous about that gap. I was a reviewer of the English Language Arts Common Core, but not all my feedback got in there. If you go to Appendix A, though, you can find all of the detail. So look at Appendix A. So kids have to know how to parse multisyllabic words. And then you have to, this is a good point to bring writing instruction and reading instruction together so they inform each other. Because when you get into spelling, you need to be writing the words, hearing the words, segmenting the sounds, hooking the sounds up with letters, writing it down, and then reading it back to say this is the right word. And the problem is a lot of kids, when they come to the reading the back process, they don't know if it's the right word or not. So we have loads of invented spellings going on all the way through secondary school. So you need to have a speller. And the core reading programs now weigh about 2 tons, so the teachers can't take them home. They're too heavy. And spelling is sort of at the 11th hour of the day, and so you're not necessarily getting to it. And this is a problem. So there are rules about English spelling. Some of them just are, they're conventions. Like, why does the word floss have 2 S's on the end? I don't know. It just does. And so these things just have to be taught, grin and bear it. Then we get to prefixes and suffixes, and this is really interesting. You learn about a couple of prefixes in end of first grade and beginning of second, and then they just stop instruction. And in terms of suffixes, you learn about ing and ed and plural s, but that's about it. Nothing on derivational suffixes, which is what most of our reading beyond third grade consists of multisyllabic words that have Greek and Latin suffixes. So teach it. We really, and a good spelling program would have this information, but you can also go out to the web or to some good websites and pick up this information. So what we find is morphological knowledge predicts reading. We've looked at the FAIR data. We have a new morphological knowledge task for the FAIR Common Core, and it predicts 9% unique variance above prior FCAT, prior FAIR reading comprehension, the maze, the spelling, everything. It stands out and says, teach me. So it's teachable. That's the good news. It's one of these malleable skills. What's tricky about it with morphology is that some things, morphological shifts, are pretty easy. Suit to suitable. But then you get sign to signal. You have a phonological shift. And English loves to preserve the phoneme. That's why Chomsky and Halley back in 1968 said we are a morphophonemic language. Then the hardest is 2 shifts, mature to maturity, theory to theoretical. So as you add the cognitive load, it's a linguistic cognitive issue. You're adding tricky things about phonological shifts and spelling shifts. This is what trips a lot of kids up when they're reading beyond third grade. At the word level. Lots of things trip them up beyond the word level, too. So in teaching beginning reading, think carefully about the text that you give them, how you're going to group the kids, and what routines you should have to align with your instructional goals. So here's an example of partner practice, because the thing I always hear from teachers is, how can I work with this small group who are maybe falling behind? What do I do with the rest of the students? Well, partner practice is a really good, meaningful way to engage the rest of the students. So you have a better reader, for example, reading the text, and the second reader might correct the first reader's errors, or vice versa. You can order them. And then they switch roles, and they're working with each other. So they're close enough in reading skills that this can actually be a successful pairing. So peer-assisted learning strategies are a well-researched strategy, one of the first set of studies that the Wentworth Clearinghouse looked at and approved. And so it can be a supplement to a core reading program, and you can pair their students creating the dyads with one high and one low performer, but it's best to rank order your kids according to your judgment or some kind of performance data you have, and then take the top student, pair them with the middle student, next top student with the next below the middle student. So you get pairs that can work well with each other in terms of their ability. Then there really is no data on this kind of groupings to meet instructional goals. We went around and around in the practice guide. So we took it out as a recommendation, but everybody knows you have to differentiate instruction. So we need more research in this area. But I will say that one-on-one instruction works best, but you can make small groups work as well as one-on-one. But when we're talking about kindergarten and first grade, the small groups really can't get larger than 4. And that's one of the huge challenges when you're working in real school settings, how to staff this. You need just to encourage you to do it, though, every dollar you put in during primary is going to reduce the increasingly expensive and less successful reading intervention above 4th grade. Well, particularly above 6th grade. The data there is not good. So anyway, you have this period where you're reading with the student, you're scaffolding them, you're trying to find text that's challenging but not too challenging. The scary thing about the Common Core is they keep emphasizing all this text complexity and challenging text. And finally in there, David Coleman and Susan Pimental in the appendix to it's guidance to the publishers, which is on the CCSSO website. They finally said, yeah, some of your kids may be below level, so you have to take that into account when you select text. Yes, finally they said it. So you really have to look. That's why we got to get everyone reading well in the primary grades, because it becomes a nightmare in middle school when you've got kids reading 4 grade levels below to 4 grade levels above. Teachers really struggle to meet all needs and differentiate. So anyway, part of the scaffolding process is to get students to be metacognitive and strategic and think about what they're reading and look at the patterns they may already know and apply that knowledge to their decoding. So these are all some sample teacher prompts that you could be using in that kind of scaffolding. And then hopefully students can become better at self-monitoring and to self-correct their errors. And you can play fix-it games where the teacher reads sentences and students fix those that don't make sense. Oral reading practice has its place, but at a certain point, if I were to ask you to read out loud from some complex text, you would hate me for it. So don't do it too long. Figure out ways with silent reading that you can hold the students accountable for what they're reading. So rich discussions about what they've read is something you want to move towards. But in this beginning acquisition phase, you gotta hear them read for a part of the time, and then scaffold them so they get to the right pronunciation. And at this level, they're not reading words that are complex in terms of the vocabulary. So you're working on vocabulary with a totally different set of text. Your goal right now is to just get them to be good decoders in English. Then you move to getting them to be good comprehenders. You're working on their oral language comprehension already, but now this diagram from Hollis Scarborough called the reading rope is an interesting one because it has the language variables, it has word recognition variables. And these things are separate strands that come together over time as you become a skilled reader. And actually, I'm working on an article right now from our latent variable modeling over the grades to suggest that actually we should be flipping this rope. At the very beginning, the emergent literacy skills are so tightly related to each other, you can't really unpack them. They're one big oral language conglomerate. And over time, they start to differentiate. The importance about that is that as they start to differentiate, you can then you can work differentially on skills with your older readers. You know where they're weak. So content area reading. Now we're getting third grade and above. So we know a lot. Jeannie Wanzik and I have a chapter in the second edition of the RTI handbook coming out. It covers this whole PowerPoint as well. So we know working on vocabulary instruction and some comprehension strategy instruction, discussing what you've read, and increasing student motivation and engagement, which is often choosing the right books and giving students sort of ownership of coming back to a group and working together on a product. These, John Guthrie's research, 4th grade through 8th grade, is particularly helpful in talking about engagement and motivation. He uses science text primarily, but social studies texts work very well to engage students. I'm going to give you an example of a social studies lesson in a little bit. But vocabulary. The tricky thing about vocabulary is we're sort of teaching definitions and assuming that covers the job. Well, there are lots of dimensions to knowing a word. Knowing how to pronounce it, how to spell it, its syntactic, morphological features, how it occurs with other words, its frequency, its register, formal, informal, and how it relates conceptually to other words, its antonyms, its synonyms, and its interrelatedness with other words. So this is a very simplistic example, but knowing that warm, how it relates to hot and cold. So what it really is building a dictionary or a mental lexicon in your brain for words. And I just pulled out of a thesaurus an example of exacerbate. This is the kind of semantic web you want to build in your vocabulary instruction. You want students to have a definition, but you want to know the synonyms, related words, idiomatic relations, contrasted, and antonyms. And boy, my husband and I had an argument about some of these. These are subtle nuances. And to be a really good writer, you have to pick up on these subtleties. So this is a lifetime of work. Maybe you read and still have a dictionary by your side sometimes, and that's good because you're always building these semantic webs. And to get students to be curious about words is what Bill Nagy says is the most important thing in vocabulary instruction. You want kids to be word wizards, and that's actually the term that Isabel Beck uses. But you want them to know how all these words relate to each other, and be curious enough that they generate knowledge from knowing a root word, for example. They know all the extensions. Because in the Isabel Beck kind of robust vocabulary instruction, Miami-Dade uses a basalized version of her program. You can only teach about 300 unique vocabulary words in a year. And yet we know when kids come to first grade, there are those that have vocabularies of 6,000 words and those that have less than 3,000 words. So how are we going to close the gap? We've got to teach words, because to do so, not to do so is unethical, but a lot of research will say it's hopeless because vocabulary is all incidental learning in the home. But we've got to do some direct vocabulary instruction. So let's be mindful about the words we pick, knowing that if you teach the root, that the extension, those derivational suffixes and prefixes, all of those words will come together as a package. And then make sure you teach the definition, but you go into all of these other relatedness, the multiple dimensions of the meanings of the words throughout the week. You make a point of using it. What we know about pre-K teachers is that those who use rare vocabulary, who cognitively engage their children upon listening comprehension about a story, talking about what might happen next, using future tense, past tense, engaging all the, aspects of oral language. Those teachers who do that well have kids who score higher at the end of kindergarten and have been followed all the way up into middle school and high school. So it's hugely important to teach vocabulary. Just be mindful, it's a challenging task, and try to do it so it has a lasting and multiplicative, generative kind of impact. So we know a lot about reading strategies. There's an IES Practice guide on this. The National Reading Panel summarizes these kinds of things. I'm going to give you a sample of a quick study that was done in England. Maggie Snowling's the second author, and Charles Hume. This was a random assignment to control or one of 3 intervention groups, and these were 8 and 9-year-old children. They had 3 days a week, 30 minutes of instruction over 20 weeks. They had either text comprehension intervention or an oral language intervention or a combined approach which integrated the text comprehension and oral language. These were kids who were good decoders but poor on listening comprehension and had a discrepancy between their reading comprehension and reading fluency. So they could decode well, but they could not comprehend well. This is a group of kids that we're interested in because we know how to teach decoding. But when you get to comprehension, we have less research telling us what to do. So it's interesting to find out that to look at this study. So they had the text comprehension and oral language conditions and then the combined condition. So in the text comprehension condition under metacognitive strategies, that was things like rereading, looking back, visualizing, thinking aloud, and self-explanation to yourself of what's going on in the story. And then the reciprocal teaching with text or without text in the language. Reciprocal teaching's been around a long time. Anne Brown and Emery Palinsar. It's a very effective thing to do with small groups in middle school where you assign roles to the kids to use these strategies. So the first strategy is clarifying unknown words. Is there anything in this text where we don't know the words? Discerning the key information and global background. What's sort of the context of this passage? Using your own knowledge then to predict what the story might be about, and then asking relevant questions. So this is a kind of metacognitive routine that reciprocal teaching teaches. So the oral language intervention is doing this with oral, listening comprehension, orally read, text read to them orally. Then we have inferencing from text, which is things like resolving pronouns, bridging inferences across sentences, all of the things that trip kids up, like the word therefore, what does it mean about what the previous sentences said? And so there's explicit instruction about how to draw inferences from text based on the sort of linguistic information. In figurative languages, idioms, riddles, similes, metaphors, jokes. Then they had a written narrative versus a spoken narrative, and the plenary session is kind of a summary of the intervention. So it's interesting to imagine which group did better. There are three. Remember, the third group is the combined group that actually had to do both, but at a faster pace. So the results are that all three intervention groups made significant improvements in reading comprehension relative to an untreated control. That's good. But on the long-term gains, 11 months follow-up in reading comprehension were largest in the oral language group. And that may surprise people. The oral language and the combined groups also demonstrated significant improvements in expressive vocabulary compared to the control, and this was a mediator of the improved reading comprehension in the oral language and combined groups. So they conclude that reading difficulties reflect at least partly oral language weaknesses that can be ameliorated by suitable teaching. I emphasize that this study, it was published in Psychological Science in 2010, because we forget about oral language instruction, you know, after primary grades or even after maybe second grade. Okay, switching in gears a little bit to older students. So I took up the first paragraph from Barbara Tuchman's The Zimmerman Telegram, and I'll just read it to you quickly. The first message of the morning watch plopped out of the pneumonic tube into a wire basket with no more premonitory rattle than usual. The duty officer at the British Naval Intelligence twisted open the cartridge and examined the German wireless intercept it contained, without noting anything of unusual significance. When a glance showed him that the message was in non-naval code, he sent it to the political section in the inner room and thought no more about it. The date was January 17th, 1917, past the halfway mark of a war that had already ground through 30 months of reckless carnage and no gain. So what makes this text difficult? Consider the text type and the structure, the prior knowledge, the vocabulary, the discourse features, and the inferences needed. So this is historical fiction. And history text often is trying to persuade you of a point of view. And Barbara Tuchman clearly has an anti-war sentiment. You can see that in the 30 months of reckless carnage and no gain. And there seems to be an indictment of the war bureaucracy. It's narrative structure, historical, nonfiction. You need to know about World War I and who was fighting it, early 20th century communications, and what is the Zimmerman Telegram, and what does that mean, non-naval code. Here is the actual Zimmerman Telegram. You can pull it off of the National Archives. And at the end of January 1917, the German government, desperate to break the stalemated trench warfare, announced it would resume unrestricted submarine attacks. The United States broke diplomatic relations with Germany, and further events pushed the nation even closer to war. On March 1st, I want to show you this political cartoon of the time. On March 1st, the newspapers published a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the United States. For attacking the United States, the Mexicans could recoup lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Having lived in Texas for 27 years, this was particularly intriguing to me. Intercepted by the British, the telegram was published widely in American newspapers and inflamed popular opinion against the Germans. So here's Woodrow Wilson trying to move up the date of Congress declaring war. April 16th wasn't soon enough. He wants it to be April 2nd, and he's got his American ships sunk without warning, American lives lost. So backing up here, in teaching reading in content areas like history and social sciences, which is now part of the Common Core requirement. There's a lot that we can do with really engaging text through like the National Archives, what's available. It's a lot of work for teachers, so we should help teachers pull some of these resources together for them. But kids can do a lot of searching on the internet under adult supervision so that they can pull out the Zimmerman telegram. They can research the different perspectives on whether we should go into World War I, not into World War I. And that gives you the Common Core standard of comparing and contrasting arguments in text. So there's lots of ways to build motivation and engagement in teaching, especially with these authentic documents. So anyway, the situation model is a term that Walter Kinch came up with that essentially means you have to create a mental model about what the text is about that you're reading. Here we have to know something about the World War I, so building some background knowledge about World War I is a good idea with many of our students. And then some of the vocabulary like mnemonic tube, hey, that's a little bit out of date, so we have to explain some of those terms. So there is actually good research on how to model strategies like activating background knowledge, questioning, searching for information, summarizing, graphic organizers, identifying story structure. And more research is coming out on how to lead quality discussions, how to organize collaborative teams of students. The reciprocal teaching strategies are good because you can give each student one of those strategies, and that's their role with the group. Then they report back to the class as a whole. And model thinking like a historian. This is fascinating to students. They think that whatever is written must be true. Guess what? Different people have different opinions, and so you get them comparing and contrasting those opinions and trying to weigh the evidence of who has the best argument. So this leads into a whole new topic called disciplinary literacy. Has actually very little research behind it, but I mention it to you because you'll probably be hearing the term a lot. But it's an interesting heuristic, at least, that each discipline has different kinds of text and different requirements about what counts as evidence. So I've listed some of these evidence base. Mathematics is interested in formal proof, science, formal proof, empirical observation. History is all of this multiple sourcing idea. So engaging the students in the disciplinary text and looking at the text from that discipline's point of view is worth trying. So here are some strategies for teaching history. This really does not look like anything new. Who, what, when, where, why. But doing this in a clever way so you could, for example, organize your readings of multiple text about a topic into these kind of graphic organizers. And the new Common Core assessments have the Park assessment has a few of these kind of things where you can click and drag a part of a graphic organizer into completion. And getting at the gist of the text. So we're not as successful in turning struggling readers around at the middle and high school level. But we do have some activities that do work, particularly with students who are close to being on grade level. When they're way far behind, you know, it's challenging. There are some successful stories. Maureen Lovett at the Hospital for Sick Children in Canada has done probably the best work and has a program actually for working with adolescents who are way, way far behind. But anyway, remember how students learn. We want to engage their prior understandings, what they do know, try to build on that. And you have to look at the factual knowledge and the conceptual framework. So how do you get to be an expert if you're a novice? It's just sometimes they're qualitative leaps to help them understand new information and that the Common Core is going to require the knowledge building in the Common Core, working back from college and career readiness all the way back to kindergarten, is a daunting task, and there's a fast pace of progression through increasingly complex text. And teaching the students to monitor their own understanding. So if they don't understand, they stop, they go back, they seek help, whatever. That's really a very important step. So in summary, we want to give students just manageable difficulties, not too challenging, but just right to challenge them. Identify a set of enduring connected ideas. You don't remember things unless the ideas are connected. Make students thinking visible to teachers and students. That's where formative assessment comes in. And when you see their misconceptions, as a teacher, you hopefully will be able to get them on the right track. Inculcate habits of mind, so they're assessing their own progress, so they're knowing what their objective is, and they're working with the teacher, with parents to get there, and establish classrooms as learning communities. We've done a lot of work with extensions to the home. If you have questions about that, I can talk about that as well. Thank you.
We incorporated the Common Core standards this year, and we really like it because we are a core knowledge school. But
Core knowledge.
we serve an inner city population where a lot of the kids, they come to us from the public school. All of them are on the Step Up for Students grant scholarship. So they come to us and they're like what you were saying, like 3 grade levels below. So we've seen the difference when the child starts with us from kindergarten, but it's those middle children, like in the 3rd grade and up, it's such a gap. It's such a gap. And so we are doing RTI, and we do reading reflex, but I was wondering any other programs that you could recommend for reading intervention. And I couldn't get the last name of that Making Sense of Phonics book that you were talking about.
It's Isabel Beck.
Beck? Okay.
B-E-C-K. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're interested in interventions for above 3rd grade for kids?
Or all of them, or any reading programs that you would recommend.
Well, there are a lot in the beginning reading phase. I mean, actually, we're doing, so you're talking about like pull-out intervention? I mean, the first thing you want to do is have a really strong core reading program. Right. So look at the phonics instruction, particularly for kindergarten, 1st grade. Make sure it's really sequential and explicit with the student anthology material following what's taught in the lessons. So students they're practicing what they're being taught. So good core, and I know we're in a core adoption right now. So the interventions, so Patricia Vadisi has Sound Partners, and she uses the Bob books. So actually, you could put this together yourself. I mean, the Bob books are from Scholastic, and they are decodable books, and then you move into their chapter books. Along with Isabel Beck's Making Sense of Phonics, and some of my ideas about the Alconen boxes, you could actually put this together. But the Sound Partners has been used in Florida, and it can be done with paraprofessionals. So there's empirical data with paraprofessionals using it quite successfully, mostly one-on-one, but also small groups. So that's a very good one. The thing is that success for all is one-on-one. Reading recovery is one-on-one. It's a lot of these things that have been built for one-on-one aren't feasible in real school settings. So I was trying to look for something with a small group, assuming that's more of what you're talking about.
You mentioned that training that you were talking about, I don't know, towards the end I didn't catch her name, where you said that she does training on those extremes where some of the students
Maureen Lovett, L-O-V-E-T-T, Hospital for Sick Children. Yes, and she combines a number of package programs. Well, she has her own program now. I can't remember the name of it. If you Google her, maybe you'll be able to get it from her. So she works with older kids who really have serious word recognition problems, but she moves, so she has explicit instruction on the phonics I showed you, but she also moves into all of the comprehension strategies that I shared with you as well. She, small group instruction, intensive, you know, for example, if you have a second grader who doesn't read at all, 80 hours of intensive reading instruction daily for 8 weeks might close that gap. The further you wait to third grade, then you're doubling that. I mean, that's why it's so cost effective to put the money into one-on-one or small group instruction as soon as the student is falling behind. It's a little challenging to identify in kindergarten because it can be a lot of false positives, but by first grade for sure. Second half of first grade, definitely. You should really be thinking about if a student's not on grade level, what can I do to make sure we catch them up? Thanks.
So the Children's Trust in Miami is investing in, runs many summer programs for children, and is thinking about how to invest in providing reading for the children who attend those summer programs, many of whom are at risk for reading. What would you suggest be done in 6-week summer programs for children who are at-risk readers? How many hours of instruction, what type of instruction, and so forth?
Yes, actually, I worked with the Just Read Florida group and the Florida Department of Ed on their checklists for summer reading camp. And in it, we recommend at least 4 hours of daily instruction and on reading. And out of that, I wanted at least 2 times when you work with small groups, and the groups no larger than 4. It sort of got watered down to at least 1 time and group size of at least 6. But the research shows that you've got to have the small group work. What you can do as a whole class is listening comprehension, or as you pull a small group, you can have meaningful activities going on in the other parts of the room. And I forgot to mention on our website, fcrr.org, the student center activities and empowering teacher routines are very popular worldwide for small group or center activities. So I think what's really important about summer reading camp is ideally it should happen at the end of first grade, not waiting till you fail FCAT and doing it after third grade. We have much more evidence of effectiveness with early intervention at the end of first grade. And there are some counties in Florida that have figured that out. So my home county, Leon County, does first grade summer reading camp, and we're helping Manatee County actually compare first grade versus third grade. You have to make sure you have really valid and reliable measures to identify the right kids, so you don't have a lot of false positives in filling up your slots in summer reading. But if you can, first grade's the way to do it. The other thing is to make sure that you have some of these, your instructional materials cover exactly what I pointed out. Explicit instruction in the alphabetic system, then moving into the morphological layers and practice with reading. So enough hours, enough intensity with small groups, the right structured materials with good fidelity, which means training the teachers to be able to use them well. And then the progress monitoring. I would say use your data in May from your end of year interim assessments to place your students before summer reading camp starts, which is typically 6 to 8 weeks, so that you don't waste time reassessing them during the first week of summer camp. You're ready to go. And then use curriculum-based assessment during the summer camp to make sure you're seeing progress. And then a lot of districts are using SAT 10 or something to see if they meet standards. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, 4 hours a day. For, I mentioned that 80 hours for second grade. We talked to third grade, we don't even have 80 hours with, say, if we go to 8 weeks, then we do with the 4 hours a day. Yes. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned this summer that IES was publishing a guideline for teachers, and kept referring to it as the foundational skills. Could you repeat
Practice
the title?
guide. Yeah, the IES has these practice guides. If you Google IES practice guides, you'll come to all of them. So this one should be out in the summer. It's called Foundational Skills in, let's see, Foundational Skills in Reading for Understanding, kindergarten through third grade. So colon, kindergarten through third grade.
Thank you.
The measure. One over there?
About what type of instruction would be most appropriate for that population.
Yeah, the question is after-school programs for English learners, and what type of program would be most effective. We're talking about primary grade children and middle school as well. So in the middle school population, you may have some newcomers. The thing with English learners, the most important thing is, are they literate in their home language? If so, your job of teaching them to read English is so much easier. I worked in bilingual education in Texas for 27 years, and our challenge there was we did not have much home literacy, so it was a challenge. We could teach decoding, but then they didn't know the meaning of the words that they were pronouncing. So we have to do a lot of the oral language work at the same time, the way I described the vocabulary instruction. So you're doing decoding instruction with the alphabetics of English, and at the same time you do listening comprehension with them, where you read them quality literature that's over their reading level, but the focus is to build their understanding of the word meanings and how that kind of academic language is connected, the ideas are connected. So that's generally what you want to do. I mentioned some good decoding programs already. We are developing an oral language program, but it's not ready for mass distribution, but we're putting in a lot of the syntax work in addition to the vocabulary. It's being in efficacy trials right now up in Escambia County around Pensacola, in schools that are under-resourced, and the children there are, well, you know, they're learning academic language too. So we find that kind of work is important. Unfortunately, in this country, it's all predicted by socioeconomic status, whether you're an English learner or a native speaker. Everybody needs to work on academic language unless they come from a highly literate household where the parents are using words like occurrence at the dinner table, right? That's the kind of incidental learning that's happening in wealthier households that we have to recreate in schools, but we have to increase the rate of it because we only have children for so many hours in school. So after school, that's a wonderful way to extend the time. Hopefully, if they're doing something good in the school day, they're coming to you. If they're doing something good, you can build on that. If they're not doing great things, then you're going to have to create what I did in this PowerPoint to actually make up for the school day, unfortunately. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
For the early elementary children, particularly kindergarten to first grade age, are there any specific standardized measurements you have to identify these children? Because a lot of them, they score very well, even though underneath there are there are learning issues, potential learning issues to come.
Well, there are a lot of clinical measures. You know, if I went back to that slide where are you talking about things that teachers could administer?
To look at reading readiness or any identifying factors that they need to do, and we do that in February of their kindergarten year, so the school can then provide any intervention. But they only have so much funds, and so they can only provide for a certain amount of children. So they really want to identify the children that would need the services.
Right. Well, okay. The school, starting a year from this fall, will have the Common Core version of FAIR, and it has a lot more of the oral language test. Right now, there's a vocabulary assessment, but the items have been out for so long, a lot of teachers are teaching to them. That's the sad fact. So this new one, the items will appear in cyberspace into your laptop or whatever. So we will dodge that bullet. But in the meantime, what we use, our Woodcock-Johnson test battery, we use a clinical evaluation of language function test to get at the oral language. We use the Gates-McGinnity pre-reader listening comprehension measure, for example. So there are a lot of really good standardized measures that have to be administered by someone who's trained to do that, that are predict. The FAIR test have a probability of reading success that predicts to being on or above grade level on the Stanford Achievement Test. So, you know, it's a pretty good way to have a rough screen as long as, you know, teachers aren't teaching to the items. We have found the vocabulary items are pretty good. They're not teaching to those as much. So you could use the vocabulary part of the FAIR as an indicator and then follow up with some of your own individualized testing to find areas, sort of profiles of strengths and weaknesses.